I'm excited to host Janneke for the seminar here today. Many of you know her and her work, but just a bit of background. She's trained with a few great people you might have heard of. So she did her PhD at Duke with James Clark. She did a postdoc after that at Minnesota with Dave Tillman, and then another postdoc at Santa Barbara with Jonathan Levine. After that, she started a professorship at the University of Washington. And then quite excitingly last year, she moved to ETH, starting and continuing the plant ecology group there. So I'm excited that she's here. And I think it's good to know that she is here in Zurich these days. I think when I first started out in ecology, it was a lot about the niche versus neutral debate, and she's made some cool contributions experimentally and theoretically here, including a paper with one of my favorite titles ever, actually, called A Niche for Neutrality. I like that one. So in addition to this experimental and theoretical work, she's done a lot of community ecology work, especially in forests, especially with forest responses to climate change, involving field work and also citizen science. And so there is a ton of overlap, of course, with the work of ASL. And she's moved to Switzerland, so she's going to have to find an additional mountain in addition to Mount Rainier. She'll probably be able to do that. I think she's probably making some progress there. So as I said, I'm really excited to welcome Janneke. For the questions that you guys have, if you have a question during her seminar, you can put them into the chat. And then at the end in the Q&A section, I can start asking those, and you can also either raise your hand using the raise hand button, should be in the bottom controls, or you can just speak up and ask a question, and I'll try and make sure everyone's questions are asked. Yeah, so with that, I'd like to welcome Janneke. Her talk today is titled The Long and Short of It, Forest Community Turnover with Climate Change May Depend on Disturbance. So take it away, Janneke.
Great, thanks, Ian. Just get... All right, thanks, Ian, for hosting, and Catherine for inviting me. And if there's any noise issues or I'm speaking too softly, definitely let me know. And of course, thanks to all of you for joining me today and giving me a chance to talk a little about some of the work I've been doing, mostly in Washington. I haven't been here quite long enough to have accumulated any studies here in Switzerland, but I am planning on setting up research in forests in Switzerland. And before I move on, I also want to acknowledge my co-authors, Amy Engert, Peter Dunwitty, Kavya Pradhan, Katie Goodwin, and Rachel Wilson. These are collaborators at University of Washington and University of British Columbia, both graduate students and PIs. And obviously this work would not have been possible without them. And what I'm going to be talking to you about today is a little bit of a mix of old and new. I'm sort of counting on maybe for those of you that might have been at my interview like over 2 years ago, that COVID has basically wiped everything that I could have possibly said from your memory. But if you're somebody who does have a very good memory, hang on, because the second half of the talk does cover some new stuff. So just by way of motivation, like a lot of ecologists and probably a lot of you, a lot of my work is motivated by the fact that our climate is changing, has been changing in the last 150 years and is changing with anywhere up to a degree of Celsius warming already in some places, and another couple of degrees predicted for the next 50 to 100 years. So that motivates my work, and it as a community ecologist, it makes me wonder how will these kinds of climatic changes affect the biological communities around us. And so just to put this in context, here is a picture of one of my favorite places on Earth. This is Mount Rainier in Washington State. And at higher elevations, sort of this picture was taken in the fall. So the sort of reddish areas here are basically indicated with fall colors. And those are the areas where the sort of beautiful subalpine and alpine meadows are. They're have a much narrower elevational range in the US than they do here in Switzerland, partly because we don't have cows running around. There aren't cows running around all over Mount Rainier keeping some of the trees down. But essentially at these higher elevations, you have these beautiful wildflower meadows with trees mixed in. And then at lower elevations, you have these dense forests. And so the kinds of questions that I'm interested in asking is, will these lower elevation forest communities simply move up and replace these alpine wildflower communities? Is that a reasonable prediction? How rapidly will these changes occur, these community shifts following climate change? And what are the actual drivers of any change that we may see? Are they sort of direct physiological and demographic responses to climate, or are they maybe mediated by some other factors that are associated with climate, say different species interactions or disturbance, et cetera? So those are the kinds of questions that motivate much of my research and that of my group. And so what I'd like to do today is to share with you a couple of different stories, a couple of different vignettes of research of some of the approaches we've used to try to address these questions of how communities, and in this case, forest communities, might respond to climate change. And so in the first part of the talk, I'm going to present results essentially looking at how forest communities have already responded to climate change, both in recent times, in the last 40 or so years, and what those community shifts look like. And then I'm going to talk, also going to present results on how these same forest communities have responded to longer term climate change in the Holocene, so in the last 12,000 years. And essentially, this approach sort of takes advantage of the fact that if we want to know what happens in the future, understanding what's happened in the past in response to similar types of climate change could really help us with that. So that's kind of the first half to 2/3 of my talk. And then the next thing I'd like to do, and this ends up being a little more of the speculative side of things, is kind of discuss what, and I guess I'm already going to the punchline, what explains some of the differences in responses we see in these more short-term responses, the last 40 years of change, versus responses of forest communities in the Holocene in the last 12,000 or so years. So that's kind of the outline and the map of the results I'm going to show to you. But first, I'll tell you a little bit about the study system. And just geographically, just quick reminder, we're over in Europe, and where all this work takes place is in the far northwest corner of the continental US, in the state of Washington. And there's lots of very lovely mountains there, including Mount Rainier, or Mount Tahoma, which is a 4.2 kilometer high volcano, not so active these days. And it's the place where I have done almost all of my work in the state of Washington. And it's a really great place to think about climate change and to study ecological responses of climate change, partly because it's a mountain, and so there's a lot of climate gradients, but also because it's been a national park for the last 110 or so years. So the human disturbances beyond, anthropogenic warming and potentially some deposition are actually rather minimal. Some characteristics of of Mount Rainier, I highly recommend for any of you that have the chance to go and visit it. I've already mentioned the lush wildflower meadows at high elevations. They're really spectacular. The growing seasons are very, very short, so you get this profusion of alpine wildflowers blooming at the same time. At lower elevations, you get really, really large trees. So this is one of my first graduate students, Eileen Ettinger, who's hugging a Douglas fir. And this is actually, it's probably about 2 meters in diameter. And this is actually not such an unusual size at the lower elevations in these forests. So very, very large, dense forests. And then of course, on the climate side of things, snow, especially at high elevations, plays a really strong role. So the communities I'm going to be talking about today are the coniferous forests of that blanket, sort of the lower to mid elevations of Mount Rainier. And these are, unlike the forests here, these are almost entirely conifers. I think I'm trying to see, you all have firs here, but not these firs. I think you do have Douglas fir here, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I guess. I don't know if it's planted as a plantation species, but it is native to Mount Rainier. And so these are just some of the species that I'll be talking about. Okay, so that's the community. So let's dive right into the data. So the first vignette, essentially thinking about how forests have responded already to recent anthropogenic warming. So the first thing I want to do is walk you through some possibilities of how communities might have responded to warming. And essentially, the expectations, the null hypothesis, as it were, which is that communities shift predictably and essentially shift up the mountains. This comes from the assumption that species occur at elevations that match their climate niches. And so what that means is that any one location where you census a community, the species you're going to see in that community are going to have the climatic tolerances associated with the environment at that elevation. And then, of course, if we jack up the temperature, species in a very well-behaved manner march up the mountains, and the community shifts such that the cold-adapted species decrease in abundance and the warm-adapted species increase in abundance. So that is one possibility for the kinds of shifts we might see. Of course, we might see that communities haven't shifted at all. And so this could be the case if there's no or very slow rain shifts, if species aren't changing their distribution despite 40 years of close to 0.5 degree Celsius warming in this region. And of course, the other possibility is that we have idiosyncratic change, or at least change that isn't necessarily predictable from where species currently are on the mountain. So in other words, we might end up with some novel communities. So these are the possibilities I'd like to explore. So, okay, so what kind of data do we need for this? So first, we need community data in the past and present, or at 2 time periods that encompass, some period of anthropogenic warming. And I'm actually quite fortunate to have access to data, essentially 1,500 by 100 meter permanent plots, stands where all trees with greater than 15 centimeters diameter have been tagged, identified to species, and essentially the growth, mortality, and recruitment of all the trees in these stands have been followed since 1978. I hope it's still obvious that I inherited this data and that I wasn't around in 1970. I mean, I actually was around, but not in any sort of responsible state to be censusing these trees myself. But essentially, this is the long-term data that I have available to us. So these are available to our group. So these are the 15 forest communities. And essentially, the question is, has warming in the Pacific Northwest through differential growth, differential ingrowth, and differential mortality led these forest communities to change? Before I move on, just a shout out to the permanent sample plot network in the Pacific Northwest. These are some of the people that have helped keep this data set going. All right, so how do we test these predictions of predictable community shifts, no change versus idiosyncratic change? So sort of the first option we thought about is we could simply line up these stands by elevation or by temperature and ask whether each community became over time more like the closest lower elevation site. That's one possibility. We rejected that because climates actually, so these are maps of how mean annual temperature and winter precipitation and summer precipitation is distributed across Mount Rainier, and the stands are pretty unevenly distributed. They're not necessarily evenly distributed across elevation and climate. I mean, although it generally gets colder as you go up, it is, the climate patterns are a little more complicated than that. So what we did instead is we used other data that we had available to us from 463 500 meter squared plots that were censused in 1980 to essentially derive our expectations of what we think of as predictable community change from the relationship between community structure in these 463 plots relative to the predicted climate at that point in time at that location from climate models. Okay, so what did we do? We took this composition data. So this is just the basal area, the relative abundance of different tree species in these 463 plots. And we related it to 3 climate variables: temperature, mean annual temperature, winter precipitation, and spring precipitation. And we used a multivariate statistical approach called a canonical correspondence analysis. And I won't go into details about exactly how that works, but it's like a lot of multivariate analysis. There's environmental drivers, and these are related to the composition of communities, to the species abundances or presence absences, depending on how you set it up. And so what I'm showing you here, these aren't really results yet. This is essentially showing you how community composition is related to climate in these sites. And what the gray dots are, each of those gray dots is one of the 463 plots. The names you see there, which probably don't mean a lot to many of you, are essentially the position of the individual species that could be in those communities, and their position on this plot just shows you where in these axes, like where in space, if you had plots that had more of that species, kind of where it would pull those plots towards. And then the arrows show the climatic variables and kind of what influence they have on the composition of these plots. And the main thing I want you to take away from this is first of all, we actually, these results, again, you don't know these species, but they actually make a lot of sense. So for example, if we take Western hemlock and mountain hemlock, they sort of fall out in the warm, so the Western hemlock falls out in the warm side, so with this red arrow pointing to the right, and mountain hemlock falls out on the cold side of this graph, and that makes sense because mountain hemlock is a tree line species and Western hemlock is more of a closed forest species at low elevation. And similarly, the spruces, the Engelmann spruce falls out in more of the cold, dry side of things, whereas the Sitka spruce falls out more in the wet, warm side of things. And this also makes sense in terms of their distributions. So this is just to say that this canonical correspondence analysis that we use to derive our predictions does a pretty good job of relating community composition to climatic gradients. Okay, so what we can do once we fit this model is we can take each of our, the composition of each one of our 15 communities, so each one of these stands, and we can plot them in this canonical correspondence space. And that's just what I'm showing you here. Those are the gray dots. And then we can ask, okay, we know that these stands, these communities have experienced about 0.4, nearly half a degree of warming in the last 40 years. Where do we expect these stands to today have moved in this canonical correspondence space? And that's just the red arrows, and obviously they're the same direction and same angle. So that's where we expect each of the stands to be today. And then the black dots is actually where they are. Where they have moved in the last 40 or so years. And the main thing I want you to take away from this is actually two things. One, some of the stands have changed. Some of the communities have shifted their composition in the direction that we would have expected, but almost entirely much less than we would have expected. So they haven't, the community shifts have not been as large as we've expected. The second thing I want to point out, and here I'm just plotting those vectors of change zeroed out, is that although a lot of the arrows point, or many of the arrows point towards the left-hand warmer side of things, suggesting community shifts that are consistent with warming, a lot of the arrows point in different directions. So we are seeing some shifts that aren't exactly in the direction we expected. And just really quickly, what does this look like if you actually look at the composition of individual stands? So I'm taking here two stands, one that the one that changed the most and the one that changed the least. And what I'm plotting here on the y-axis is the basal area of different tree species that are color coded according to their relative position in canonical correspondence space. So the warmer colors just mean that they're on the warmer side of things. And hopefully you can see that the stand on the left does, like the yellows and greens, seem to be getting bigger in terms of relative abundance, and the blue seems to be getting smaller, whereas the stand on the right doesn't really seem to be much going on. So this is that's kind of putting that in context. Okay, so what have we seen in the last 40 years? What of these forest communities in response to recent anthropogenic warming? What we've seen is some shifts, so some community turnover, and even some community turnover that is consistent with what we might have expected, with species that are more abundant in warmer in warmer climate space increasing at the expense of species that are presumably more adapted to colder temperatures. But again, those shifts have been less than expected and not always directionally in the, and those community shifts have not always been in the direction that we might have expected. So what I want to do next is talk you through how these forest communities have responded to climate change in the Holocene, because of course, climate has also changed a lot over the last 12,000 years, and it'd be really interesting to know whether the kinds of shifts and turnover we see is similar or different to what we've seen in the last 40 years. So the first thing we have to know is, how did climate change over the last 12,000 years? I have to say I was a little, this is obviously not at all surprising for a paleoecologist, but I was really hoping I could just download, just like for recent climate, projections of change in the last 12,000 years, but that was a little harder than I had originally hoped. And I should also say, which is kind of embarrassing, because my PhD advisor, Jim Clark, is a paleoecologist as well as many other things. I'd sort of naively assumed that in this region, you've got the last glacial maximum at 20,000 years, huge sheet of ice, like cold, and then just sort of gradual warming over the last 20,000 years and during the Holocene. But actually, for those of you that are familiar with paleo data, you know that the climate dynamics in the Holocene are actually a lot more complicated than that. Here is a recent reconstruction of temperatures in the upper latitudes, so including here in the Holocene for the last 12,000 years. And you can see that obviously there was warming since well, that's not shown here, but presumably there was warming since the last glacial maximum. But then more recently, from about 7,000 years until the most recent anthropogenic warming, you actually have cooling. And I should also say that the data that I will tell you about in a second that we have available to us actually doesn't cover the entire Holocene. It actually covers the last 6,500 years. So during that period of time, in contrast to what I had originally thought, the climate change that we see is actually more on the cooling side of it rather than the warming, until the most recent anthropogenic warming. And the other wrinkle in this is that the kinds of climate change that happened in the Holocene was much more was multivariate. So in sort of the mid 8,000 to 4,000 years ago, it was drier, especially in the Pacific Northwest. So in addition to cooling, we also see that there's also evidence that it's also gotten wetter and moister over the last 6,000 years. Okay, so what does that, okay, so let me tell you a little bit about this data from the Holocene. So it's really fortunate to have a collaborator, Peter Dunwitty, who actually back in the 80s was really interested in understanding the Holocene, the dynamics of forests in the Holocene. And so what he did is he cored 3 ponds and lakes within Mount Rainier National Park. Unlike many, not all, but many paleoecological studies, he was really interested in the fine scale, sort of local scale dynamics. So he didn't go and pick the largest lake. He specifically wanted to pick kind of smaller ponds. Here's one of the ponds that he cored, shown here. So he took a core, and then in the mud that came up from that core, obviously older mud is older, deeper mud is older mud. And what he did is he went through there and very carefully pulled out macrofossils, these conifer species, unlike the pollen, the macrofossils, so those are just preserved needles and seeds, are actually very distinguishable to species. And these conifer species happen to produce a ton of macrofossils, so it's actually actually pretty easy to go back in time and figure out at what depth different forest communities occurred. The other nice thing about macrofossils is, unlike pollen, these would have fallen from the trees right around or near the pond. So it's much more of a local community signature as opposed to pollen, which, I mean, it doesn't go everywhere, but it tends to be, or it's thought to be, much more of a regional signature. So we essentially have 3 communities, forest communities surrounding these 3 ponds. And we have a sense of what those communities look like going 6,000 to 6,500 years back in time. I should also say, so about 31 to 48 depths ages sampled per lake. And Peter also did carbon dated quite a few depths and at different locations in these different ponds. And so we were able to build a depth age model so that for each depth, for each forest community that we reconstructed from macrofossils, we could also identify at what time, how many years before present that occurred. Okay, so back to our canonical correspondence analyses, and let's think a little, now that we know what the data is and we know what the climate change that has occurred in the Holocene is, what would we expect to happen? So just like with recent communities, one expectation is that communities shift predictably, but instead of warm adapted and dry adapted species increasing in abundance relative to cold and moisture adapted species, we'd expect the opposite, right? Because remember that climate change in the last 6,000 years in the Holocene, prior to anthropogenic warming, was from warm and dry towards cool and wet. So we would expect, if we sort of map out the different quadrants of this canonical correspondence space, we would expect movement of our ponds from kind of the drier, warmer side of things towards the colder, wetter sides of things. And I should say that these cores were taken in 1983, and probably like the most recent communities that might have experienced recent anthropogenic warming, and the top layers are like, that ends up being very difficult to sample. So it's probably about 100 or 150 years ago are sort of the most recent samples. We might also, it's possible that we'd see no change, and it's also possible that we would see change in different directions, but these are sort of the 3 different possibilities. So with no further ado, I'm just gonna map on for these 3 ponds, the beginning and the ending sides of things. And I'll just move back and forth so you can see the arrow. That's the expectation, and this is what actually happened. So the dark purple dots are where these ponds started. So this is like kind of the oldest communities. We're definitely on the drier side of things, and the newer communities, at least from 2 of the ponds, definitely shifted towards the wetter side of things in canonical correspondence space, but surprisingly, really not much of a signal or change that seems to be attributable to that axis of temperature from warmer to colder. So in some ways, I guess you could say that oh, and then just to say, I'm showing you only 2 time points, and partly that's because this is what all the time points look like, so actually kind of messy. Here's maybe an easier way to see it when you, and the division of dividing these up into these time points will become obvious in a second. So now the dark purple dots are all the samples or all the depths in those cores, the forest communities mapped on to canonical correspondence space of the forest communities that were between 3,000 and 6,000 years before present, and the pink or the lighter color are the more recent. So essentially what you can take away from this is that these communities do seem to in some ways be shifting predictably with what we know about how climate changed during the Holocene, and that they're moving from sort of the drier side of things to the wetter side of things. But surprisingly, at least to me, there doesn't seem to be a lot of change on the temperate side of things. One thing that you can't actually see from this graph, so you'll just have to believe me when I tell you, is that all these dots are actually like the size of the shifts, the amount of turnover in the Holocene is like how far these points travel is a lot more in the Holocene than it is in current, with the last 40 years. And in fact, for some of these communities, there's essentially entire turnover between sort of 6,000 to 5,000 years ago versus present. So from a location point of view, you could think of that as maybe a novel community, but not really novel regionally, if that makes sense. So there's definitely a lot of turnover over these 6,000 years, but not necessarily turnover towards communities that are not seen anywhere on the landscape. And then a final interesting tidbit we'll return to is that the other thing that Peter did is he pulled out charcoal. He noted whether there were charcoal particles as an indication of fire. And essentially ash particles and layers indicate that fires were really prevalent at the times of greatest community transit, like sort of in the 3,000 to 6,000 years, but also at the times of greatest community transition. So that's sort of an interesting tidbit. Okay, so I've just raced you through some community shifts in recent anthropogenic time where we saw slow shifts, but turnover that seemed to be consistent with anthropogenic warming really affecting how forest communities have turned over in the last 40 years. And then what I just most recently showed you is that during the Holocene, things were a little bit more complicated in that temperature, we did see large and even larger community shifts than in recent times. Those did not seem to be related to changes in temperature, at least in terms of the directionality of how the communities were shifting. And possibly, again, this is all correlational, some of these changes were associated with fire or seem to be associated with fire. So what I like to spend the last 10 or so minutes of the talk is just talking through what explains, like, how do we make sense of these two varied responses, especially in thinking about what this might mean for the future. So let's just summarize what we saw in recent times: slow community change with rapid warming. In the Holocene, we saw large community change. Of course, it is a larger point in time, but we saw larger community change with changes in fire and climate more broadly. So not just temperature, but also precipitation. And so so what I want to do now is show you, so we don't know what the drivers are or what we don't mechanistically, we can't prove, I can't prove any of the things that I'm now going to be talking about, but this I'm going to show you now is other data and other data from other experiments and studies that I think provide some possible reasons for why we see different kinds of community change more recently versus in the past. So I want to start by thinking about range shifts of individual species. Because when we talk about community shifts, what we're talking about is kind of the aggregate of what all the species are doing in terms of shifting their distributions. And I think when we think about what a range shift means for an individual species, it can help us think about when shifts are slower than we might expect, or turnover in communities is slower than we might expect, and when it might be in a different direction. So this is not a tree, as you will see, but this is, for example, a lupin growing across a gradient in temperature, and it's got a lower range edge and an upper range edge. And we might imagine that when temperatures warm, the way that the entire range shifts is if the individuals at the lower edge die, and that there's new individuals at the upper edge that recruit and colonize in that newly suitable climate space. So if that always occurs, then we have these predictable shifts in composition with warming. But of course, we could have a case where the individuals at the lower edge, or in the climatically unsuitable side of things, side of the range of the contracting range edge, simply take a long time to die. So you can think of them sort of as the living dead. And in that case, we could observe stasis or less shifts in community composition than we might expect. And similarly, on the upper range limit, we could also see cases where the climate is perfectly suitable beyond that upper range edge because of climate change, but there's just been limited colonization because dispersal doesn't get the seeds there. Maybe there's some missing partners in terms of species interactions, or maybe simply competition by residents. So the first thing we can ask, or the first thing we can ask ourselves, is whether slow mortality and recruitment limitation could possibly expect why we see slow community shifts, or less community turnover than we might expect in the last 40 or so years. And in fact, we have a lot of data that we've collected through other studies that does suggest that for these tree species at Mount Rainier National Park that, can grow up to 2 meters in size, that really slow dynamics are really potentially something that's really contributing to why these communities aren't shifting. So I'll just give you a couple of examples of what I mean by slow dynamics, of the kind that can really slow how fast species ranges shift, and thus how fast communities change in composition. So for example, for all of these conifer species that we have data for, which is about 6 or 7, when you census seedlings above their upper range edges, you generally find fewer than 1 seedling per meter squared, just within 50 to 100 meters of their upper range edges. And when I say seedling, I really mean a first-year germinant, like the one that's pictured here, which is much larger even on your laptop screen than it would be out in the forest. This particular seedling, first seedling, is probably only about 2 centimeters in height and has a very low chance of making it. And there's just very few of them beyond the upper range edges. So this is going to slow down the ability of these tree species to colonize new habitat, and that could be an explanation for these slow community shifts. We also have extremely, especially at the upper range edges, extremely slow growth. So even for the seedlings that make it, it can take them more than 75 years to reach a size of about 2 meters, which I at least think of as the lower size limit of when these trees might produce cones. So even for seedlings that make it, to move that invasion front forwards and produce seeds is just something that takes a really long time. And then finally, the data from these map stands also demonstrates to us that these trees are just really slow to die. Most of these species have less than 1% chance of dying annually. And you can do some simple math on in Excel or in R, and that will demonstrate to you that with such a low mortality rate, it would take over 40 years for half of the individuals in a population to disappear at a lower, at a lower range limit. And of course, climate could affect those mortality rates and cause them to go up, but it would have to affect them by quite a bit for the rate at which those populations disappear at the lower range edges and those ranges contract to happen at any particularly fast pace. So all this is to say that we do have a mechanism or a potential explanation for why we see slower than expected community shifts in the last 40 years in response to recent anthropogenic warming. So now what I want to think about is something different, which is fire, which is something that we think might have played a role in the slightly longer term community shifts, so across the Holocene. So just as a reminder, from 6,000 to 3,000 years ago, fire played a much more important role at Mount Rainier National Park than it does now. And one possibility, one explanation for why community shifts in the last 40 years, despite rapid climate change, have been really large. Community shifts have been really slow, while the community shifts have been really large in the last 6,000 years. It's possible that fire as a disturbance has jump-started the range shifts and thus are an explanation for the large community shifts that we might have seen. So walking back to kind of for example, you could have fire come in and kind of take out the individuals at the lower range edge, so sort of get rid of the so-called living dead. And by the same token, fire can decrease competitors, can basically just remove competitors at the upper range edges and essentially allow the range expansion to happen more rapidly than it might happen without fire and disturbance. So we don't actually have data on trees, but just one little tidbit of results that to give you a sense of the role that fire might play comes from an entirely different data set and actually data collected at a different national park in Washington. So Dr. Jim Agee conducted vegetation surveys that are very similar to the ones that we used at Mount Rainier National Park in the 80s. I think it was actually 1986, so I have the date wrong there. And in collaboration with a number of people at University of British Columbia, and including a very large crew of undergraduates. So both Rachel Wilson and Amy Ingert have spent a lot of time collecting this data and analyzing it. And the interesting or the really useful thing about the data collected at North Cascades National Park as opposed to at Mount Rainier is that there actually have been quite a few fires in the last 50 or so years. So this is a map of North Cascades National Park, and the yellow and the reds indicate sites of fire, and the circles and the X's just indicate some of these sites that were resurveyed and whether in the time between when they were first surveyed and most recently surveyed, whether they were burned or not. And we can take that information and ask, for individual species, are range shifts tied to whether these species whether these species experienced fire between the first census and the last census. And here's just two species and two sets of results. Again, not trees, but what you can see here is on the x-axis elevation and on the y-axis probability of presence. For these two species, you can see these, as you might expect, unimodal species distributions. In the blue is the probability of presence in historical time, so 30 or so years ago. In the yellow is probability of presence in plots that were unburned between the first and the second time period, and in red are the resurveys that occurred in burn sites. And you can see for at least these two species, the the shifts in distributions that occurred seem to be more likely to have occurred in burned sites than in unburned sites. So it does seem likely that at least for some species, the kinds of fires and disturbance that occurred in the Holocene could have really jump-started rain shifts, and at the same time caused larger community shifts. Okay, so where again, a little bit of speculation here, where does that leave us in terms of how we think forest communities might respond to ongoing climate change in the next 100 to 200 years? I would say at least at Mount Rainier National Park in the short term, I think we're probably going to continue to see slow forest turnover despite rapid warming. And this is because all the sort of demographic factors I talked about that would slow down rain shifts, not recruitment limitation, very slow mortality. Those are still more or less operating on the component species in these landscapes. So for me, I wouldn't expect in the short term necessarily for community shifts to start necessarily occurring at faster rates. However, this kind of depends a little bit on, but by the same token, I would say that's not to say that large shifts in community structure and large community turnover isn't possible. If you think about the last 6,000 years, that sounds like a really long time frame to us. But of course, for these trees whose generation times are 400 to 500 years, that's really, that's really not very many generations. So these tree species have seen large community shifts, in the last 6,000 years, and that will likely occur again. Especially if disturbance like fire or maybe pest outbreaks that cause higher mortality start to play a larger role in these and in other communities. And I think one way to think about disturbance is it could really play a role in the kinds of rapid and kind of nonlinear community turnover that we might expect, where things appear not to change at all until we reach some sort of threshold, and then suddenly there's very rapid change. So that would, again, very speculative, but that'd be my prediction for this region in the future. Okay, I think that is all I have for you all. So I hope I actually find timing really difficult in Zoom. So I guess it's too late to ask whether I was talking too fast, but hopefully you were able to follow some of the follow the story, and maybe have some questions, which I would be more than happy to answer. So thank you.